George sat by the window, watching the autumn leaves swirl in the wind. The small, quiet village seemed to grow quieter as the years passed. His days were long and uneventful, filled with routine tasks: feeding the chickens, chopping firewood, making tea. Each task he performed was methodical, as if ticking off a list that no longer held any meaning. His wife, Margaret, had been gone for 5 years. She was the love of his life, his constant companion, and without her, the house felt hollow. Her absence left an ache in his chest that he couldn't shake, and though his neighbors visited from time to time, George found solace only in the quiet. His home, a modest cottage at the edge of the village, was filled with remnants of a life that no longer felt like his own. Photographs of happier times adorned the walls, and her favorite chair remained by the fireplace, untouched since the day she passed. It was a shrine of sorts, a painful reminder of all he had lost. The village itself seemed to reflect George's loneliness. Once bustling with the sounds of children and market-goers, it had grown still, as the younger generation left in search of brighter futures elsewhere. George preferred it this way. He didn't want to be reminded of the world moving forward while he remained stuck in the past. Yet beneath the surface of his solitude, there was a deep longing, a need for connection, for something to break the monotony. He couldn't quite admit it, but each morning he would glance out the window, hoping that perhaps something would change. But nothing did. The wind howled that night, rattling the windows of George's cottage. A storm had rolled in suddenly, bringing with it sheets of rain and gusts that bent the trees in the nearby woods. George sat by the fire, the crackling flames offering some warmth against the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. As he sipped his tea, a strange sound caught his attention. A faint, desperate whimpering. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, but the noise persisted, growing louder with each passing minute. Curiosity gnawed at him. He pulled his old coat from the hook by the door, its worn fabric heavy on his shoulders, and stepped outside. The rain hit him hard, immediately soaking through his clothes. George squinted into the darkness, unsure of what he was looking for, but the sound came again, closer now. He followed it, his boots squelching in the mud, until he reached the front of his house. There, shivering and drenched, lay a dog. Its fur was matted with mud, and it whimpered as it struggled to stand. George's heart clenched at the sight. He knelt down, his hands trembling as he reached out to the animal. "It's okay," he murmured, unsure if the dog would understand. The dog looked up at him, its eyes filled with fear and pain. For a moment, George hesitated. Taking in a stray would be a responsibility, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. But as the rain pelted down and the dog's whimpers grew weaker, he couldn't leave it out there to suffer. With a soft grunt, George lifted the dog into his arms. It didn't resist, too weak to protest, and George carried it inside, cradling it against his chest as if it were something fragile. Back in the warmth of the house, George laid the dog near the fire, wrapping it in an old blanket. He rushed to the kitchen, his mind racing as he grabbed a bowl of water and some scraps of food. The dog barely moved, but its eyes followed him, watching as he worked. "Just hang on," George muttered, his voice thick with worry. "You're safe now." For the first time in what felt like forever, George had something to care for again, something that needed him. And in that moment, as he knelt by the dog's side, he realized how much he needed it too. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the small living room. George stirred in his chair, his neck stiff from sleeping in an awkward position. He hadn't meant to fall asleep in front of the fire, but the exhaustion of the previous night had caught up with him. He blinked, slowly turning his head to check on the dog that now lay wrapped in the blanket near the hearth. To his relief, the dog was still breathing, its chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Its eyes, now open, tracked George's movements as he stood up and stretched. The animal still looked fragile, but the fear in its eyes had subsided, replaced by a tentative trust. "Well, good morning," George said softly, unsure if he was speaking to himself or the dog. He poured some fresh water into the bowl and refilled the small plate with scraps of bread and cheese. The dog sniffed at the food, but didn't seem ready to eat just yet. George crouched down, inspecting the creature more closely. Its fur, though matted and dirty, was thick, and despite its weak state, there was a strength to its build. He wondered how long it had been out in the storm, alone and struggling. He reached out a tentative hand, offering the dog a chance to sniff it. The dog hesitated, but then pressed its wet nose against George's fingers. It was a small gesture, but George felt a warmth spread through him. He hadn't realized how much he missed this, caring for something, feeling needed. It reminded him of simpler times, of days spent tending to the small garden with Margaret, her laughter filling the air as they worked side by side. The dog shifted, its muscles twitching as it made an effort to stand. George watched as it struggled to its feet, shaky but determined. "Easy now," he murmured, moving the bowl of water closer. The dog lapped at it eagerly, its tail giving the faintest of wags. A smile tugged at the corners of George's mouth. He hadn't smiled in what felt like years. As the dog grew stronger over the next few days, George found himself reminiscing more and more about the past. The presence of another living being in the house stirred memories that had long been buried under the weight of grief. He hadn't spoken about Margaret in years, not to anyone, but with the dog, whom he had started calling Max. It was different. "You remind me of her, you know," George muttered one evening as Max curled up beside him. The dog looked up at him, ears perked, as if listening intently. George chuckled. No, really. She had that same kind of spirit. Strong, even when things got tough. He glanced at the empty chair across from him, Margaret's chair. How many nights had they sat together in this very room, sharing stories, laughing at old memories? It was the simple things he missed the most. The way she would hum while cooking dinner, the way her hand would gently brush his as they passed each other in the hall. One memory, in particular, played on repeat in his mind. A summer afternoon, years ago, when they had found a stray cat near the edge of the village. Margaret had insisted on taking it in, despite George's protests. "We don't need another mouth to feed," he had grumbled. But she had one, as she always did, and that cat had become part of their lives for the next 12 years. "I guess you're no different, huh?" George said to Max, his voice soft. "Just showed up out of nowhere. Now you've got me wrapped around your paw, haven't you?" Max, ever attentive, rested his head on George's lap. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge, a connection to a time when George's heart had been full. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. But with those memories came an underlying sadness. George couldn't help but wonder how long this peace would last. Max was still a stray at heart, and life had a way of taking things away just when they started to matter most. That fear, the fear of losing something again, gnawed at him quietly, even as he stroked Max's fur. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and for a brief moment, George allowed himself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, life had given him a second chance at something, at connection, at love, even if it was with a dog who had appeared on a stormy night. As the days turned into weeks, George and Max fell into an easy rhythm. Every morning, George would rise early, fix a cup of tea, and sit by the window, watching the sun slowly creep over the horizon. Max would always be by his side, resting his head on George's lap or lying at his feet, his presence a constant source of quiet comfort. George found himself talking to Max more and more, as if the dog could understand every word. It felt good to speak aloud again, to share his thoughts, even if they were only for his ears and Max's attentive gaze. "You're quite the listener, you know that," George said one crisp morning as they strolled along the edge of the woods. Max trotted beside him, his tail wagging in response to George's voice. "Not like those folks in town. They mean well, but they've got no patience for an old man's stories." George hadn't been much for socializing since Margaret passed. The villagers were kind, but they treated him with a sort of reverent distance, as if his grief were a fragile thing they might accidentally shatter with too much conversation. But Max wasn't afraid to get close. The dog had become a companion in the truest sense of the word, his silent loyalty filling the empty spaces of George's life. They walked together through the woods every day now, following the same path Margaret used to love. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter. George would sometimes stop, leaning on his walking stick, and stare out at the trees, memories of Margaret's laughter echoing in the rustling of the leaves. It wasn't just companionship that Max brought. He brought back a part of George that had been locked away, hidden beneath the weight of loss. With Max by his side, George felt lighter, more alive than he had in years. There was a sense of purpose now, even if it was just in the small things, making sure Max was fed, taking him for walks, talking to him in the quiet evenings by the fire. The bond between them was undeniable, unspoken, but strong. George found himself smiling more often, laughing at Max's antics. The dog had a way of lifting his spirits, even on the darkest of days. One afternoon, as they returned from their walk, George paused at the gate to his cottage and looked down at Max. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I wasn't sure about you at first, but now I can't imagine life without you." Max wagged his tail, as if he understood the depth of George's words. The villagers noticed the change in George, too. His once sullen demeanor had been replaced by a quiet contentment. They saw him more often now, walking with Max through the village or tending to his small garden. Some even stopped to chat, commenting on how the dog seemed to have brought George back to life. But beneath the surface of this newfound happiness, there was still an unspoken fear gnawing at George. He knew life had a way of taking things away, just as it had taken Margaret. What if Max disappeared one day, just as suddenly as he had appeared? What if this happiness was only temporary? For now, though, George chose to push those thoughts aside. He had learned, perhaps more than most, that happiness came in fleeting moments. And as he stood there, watching Max chase a squirrel across the yard, George decided that for now, he would simply enjoy the time they had together. The day started like any other. George and Max had their morning walk, and the sky was clear, the autumn air crisp and cool. George felt particularly at ease as they strolled through the woods, the familiar crunch of leaves underfoot grounding him in the present moment. Max was full of energy, darting between trees and occasionally returning to George's side, his tongue lolling in a happy pant. As they returned to the cottage, George paused to catch his breath. The walk had felt a little more strenuous than usual, but he chalked it up to his age. "Getting old, Max," he muttered, rubbing his chest absent-mindedly. Max looked up at him, tilting his head as if sensing something wasn't quite right. George brushed off the discomfort and made his way back into the house. He sat down at the kitchen table, intending to rest for a moment before starting the day's chores. But the moment his body sank into the chair, a sharp, crushing pain spread across his chest, stealing the breath from his lungs. The pain was unlike anything George had ever felt before. His vision blurred, and his arms felt heavy, as if the weight of the world had settled onto his chest. Panic surged through him, but he couldn't cry out. His heart raced erratically, each beat a painful reminder that something was terribly wrong. Max was at his side in an instant, whining softly, nudging George's leg with his nose. George tried to move, tried to stand, but his body wouldn't obey. The world around him spun, and he felt himself sliding from the chair to the floor, his hands clutching his chest as the pain intensified. Max barked, the sound sharp and urgent. The dog circled George, pawing at him, his whines growing louder and more frantic. George blinked, his vision narrowing to a pinprick, and in the haze of pain, he could barely make out Max's worried eyes watching him. "I'm sorry," George whispered, his voice barely a breath. I can't." He didn't know what he was apologizing for being old, for being frail, for not being able to care for Max the way he had promised, for leaving the dog alone, just as Margaret had left him. Max barked again, louder this time, as if refusing to accept what was happening. The dog nudged George's face, licking his cheek in a desperate attempt to wake him, to make him move. Through the pain, George heard the sound of paws racing toward the door, the creak of it swinging open as Max bolted outside. He tried to call after him, tried to tell him to stay, but the words wouldn't come. The world dimmed, and George's mind drifted in and out of consciousness. He could feel the cold floor beneath him, the faint throb of his heart struggling to keep going. But above it all, he heard Max's barking, distant but insistent, as if the dog was calling for help, refusing to give up. Max bolted out the door, his paws pounding against the wet ground as he raced toward the village. George had never seen the dog run like this before, so determined, so desperate. His heart had always been full of loyalty, but now, it seemed that Max was filled with an urgency beyond anything he'd ever shown. The village wasn't far, but for Max, every second mattered. His mind, as much as any dog's could, was focused entirely on one thing: bringing help to George. The wind was strong, and the ground was slick with wet leaves, but Max barely noticed the obstacles in his path. His mind raced like his feet, sensing that George's time was running out. Max's ears perked as he approached the outskirts of the village, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the villagers. He barked frantically, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed through the quiet lanes. But the village seemed sleepy and unaware of the drama unfolding just outside its borders. A couple of children playing near a shop turned toward the noise, watching as Max sped past them, barking with intensity. One of the children called out, "Look at the dog. Where's he going?" But no one understood. No one followed. Max's barking grew more frantic as he weaved through the streets, darting past shops and cottages. The few people who did notice him gave him only a passing glance, dismissing him as just another stray. Some shooed him away, annoyed by the commotion. Max reached the center of the village, his breath heavy, his heart pounding. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the small crowd near the village square. George had often spoken to the shopkeeper there, an older man named Tom, who had been a friend for years. Max's eyes locked on Tom, and without hesitation, he ran toward him. Barking and nipping at Tom's trousers, Max pulled on the fabric as if trying to drag him along. Tom, startled, looked down at the dog, frowning. "What's got into you?" he muttered. But Max wouldn't let up. He pulled harder, barking louder, making a scene that finally caught the attention of the people nearby. "What's that dog doing?" one of the villagers asked, stepping closer. Tom knelt down, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This isn't any ordinary dog. This is George's dog. He's never acted like this before." The mention of George's name stirred something in Tom. He had seen George walking with Max many times, but this urgency, this desperation, was unlike anything he had seen in a dog. Something was wrong, very wrong. Max barked again, his eyes pleading, tugging at Tom's sleeve. The moment clicked. "George!" Tom muttered, his face paling. He must be in trouble. Without another word, Tom sprang to his feet and grabbed his coat. "Come on," he called to the others nearby. "We need to follow this dog. George might be in danger." Max turned, sprinting back toward George's cottage, his legs moving faster now that he knew help was finally coming. Tom and two other villagers ran behind him, their footsteps thundering through the streets, spurred on by the dog's urgency. Time was ticking, and Max could only hope they weren't too late. The cottage came into view, its small shape barely visible under the thick canopy of trees that surrounded it. Max reached the door first, scratching and barking furiously, urging the villagers to hurry. Tom was right behind him, his breath ragged from the run, but determination drove him forward. He pushed open the door without knocking, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room until they landed on George, lying motionless on the floor. "Oh God," Tom whispered as he rushed over to his friend. George's face was pale, his chest barely rising with each shallow breath. Tom knelt beside him, pressing his fingers to George's neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. "He's alive," Tom called out, though the relief was short-lived. George was clinging to life by a thread. One of the villagers, a woman named Anna, stepped forward, pulling out her phone to call for an ambulance. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled as she relayed the details of George's condition. The third villager, an older man named Peter, stood frozen near the doorway, uncertainty etched across his face. "Should we move him?" Peter asked, his voice shaky. "No," Tom replied firmly. "We wait for the ambulance. Moving him could make things worse." He glanced down at George, guilt washing over him. He hadn't visited George in weeks. None of them had. They all knew George preferred his solitude, but still, he should have checked on him more often. This could have happened days ago and no one would have known. Max paced restlessly beside George, his nose nudging the man's hand as if trying to wake him. The dog's whines filled the small cottage, a sound of deep worry and fear. Tom reached out, patting Max's head gently. "You did good, boy. You brought us here." Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the ambulance. Anna kept glancing at her phone, willing the sirens to come faster. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and making the house feel even colder. Peter fidgeted by the door, his unease growing with each passing second. "What if they don't get here in time?" "They will," Tom said, though his voice lacked the conviction he wanted it to have. Max, sensing the rising tension, lay down beside George, his head resting on George's chest. The small rise and fall of George's breath was barely noticeable, but Max stayed close, his eyes never leaving his owner's face. The room was silent, save for the occasional crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, in the distance, they heard the sound they had been waiting for, the faint wail of an approaching ambulance. Relief washed over the room like a tidal wave, but the fear remained. George was still fighting for his life, and there was no telling how much time he had left. Max lifted his head at the sound, his ears twitching. Help was here, but would it be enough? The paramedics burst through the door, their movements swift and purposeful. The sound of their heavy boots on the wooden floor filled the small cottage, and for a moment, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. George lay unconscious, pale and unmoving, as they quickly assessed his condition. Tom, Anna, Peter, and Max stood back, their eyes wide with worry, helpless to do anything but watch. Max whimpered softly, pacing the length of the room as the paramedics worked. His tail was low, his ears flat against his head. The dog's instinct told him something was terribly wrong, and he couldn't bear to see George like this. So still, so vulnerable. Max had done everything he could to get help, but now it was out of his control. "Heart attack," one of the paramedics muttered, checking George's pulse and breathing. His partner nodded, setting up the portable defibrillator. The cold metallic clank of equipment filled the room as they prepared to act, their faces tight with concentration. "Step back, everyone," the lead paramedic instructed, motioning for Tom and the others to clear the space around George. Max resisted, his paws planted firmly beside George's body, refusing to leave. It took a gentle nudge from Tom to coax the dog away. "Come on, Max. Let them do their job." Max whined but relented, moving back to the far corner of the room. His eyes never left George as the paramedics administered a shock, the defibrillator sending a jolt through his body. For a moment, nothing happened. The seconds stretched on, thick with silence. Then, a weak, uneven heartbeat registered on the monitor. "He's responding," the paramedic said, relief evident in his voice. "We've got a pulse." A collective breath was released in the room, though no one allowed themselves to fully relax. George's life still hung in the balance, and the race to save him was far from over. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately," the paramedic said, motioning to his partner to prepare the stretcher. "He's stable for now, but we need to move quickly." Tom, his face ashen with worry, nodded. "Do whatever you need to. Just don't let him die." Max, sensing the urgency, trotted to the door as if ready to follow the paramedics to the ambulance. His loyalty to George knew no bounds, and the idea of being separated from him now was unbearable. But Tom held him back gently, his voice soft. "You can't go, Max. Not this time. You have to wait here." Max barked softly, his eyes pleading, but Tom's hand remained firm on his collar. The paramedics carefully lifted George onto the stretcher, securing him before wheeling him out to the waiting ambulance. Max followed as far as the door, his body trembling with anxiety, as the vehicle's doors closed with a loud metallic clunk. The sirens wailed, piercing the quiet night air as the ambulance sped away, leaving a trail of flashing lights in its wake. Max stood frozen at the threshold, his tail tucked between his legs, his eyes glued to the spot where George had disappeared. He whimpered softly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical burden. "He'll be okay," Tom said, his voice low, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Max or trying to convince himself. "He's strong. He'll pull through." But as the sound of the ambulance faded into the distance, a heavy silence settled over the cottage once again, and Max remained by the door waiting. Hours passed, and the stillness inside the cottage became almost unbearable. The soft ticking of the clock was the only sound that accompanied the crackling fire in the hearth. Tom, Anna, and Peter stayed with Max, each of them too anxious to leave. They knew there was nothing they could do at the hospital, but somehow being in George's home, surrounded by his things, felt like the right place to wait for news. Max refused to move from the door. His large brown eyes were fixed on the spot where the ambulance had disappeared, as if by sheer force of will, he could bring George back home. His once wagging tail now hung limp, and the spark of energy that always shone in his eyes had dimmed. Tom watched Max with a heavy heart. "He's not going to leave that spot, is he?" he murmured to Anna, who shook her head. "He's loyal," Anna replied softly. "He's waiting for George. He doesn't understand what's happening." The phone on the table rang, startling everyone. Tom jumped up, rushing over to answer it. "Hello." His voice was tight with hope and fear. There was a pause, and then a familiar voice spoke on the other end. It was the doctor from the hospital. "Tom, it's Dr. Pearson. I'm calling about George." Tom swallowed hard, bracing himself. "How is he?" "He's stable, but it was a close call. The heart attack was severe, but he responded well to treatment. He'll need to stay here for a while, but I'm optimistic about his recovery. It'll be slow, but with the right care, he should be okay." Relief flooded Tom's body, and he sagged against the table, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank God. Thank you, Doctor. We were all so worried." Max perked up at the sound of Tom's relieved tone, his ears twitching. He padded over to Tom, his eyes wide with anticipation, as if sensing that good news had come. "We'll take good care of him," Dr. Pearson continued, "but he'll need rest, and someone to look after him once he's discharged. Can you manage that?" Tom glanced at Max, who was now sitting at his feet, his tail wagging slightly as he waited for confirmation that George would come back. "Yeah," Tom said quietly. "We'll look after him. He's got plenty of people and a dog waiting to help." After hanging up the phone, Tom crouched down beside Max, running his hand through the dog's fur. "He's going to be okay, boy. You did it. You saved him." Max barked softly, his tail wagging a bit faster now. It wasn't a loud celebration, but a quiet understanding that George would be coming home. The next few days were a blur of visits to the hospital and updates from the doctors. George remained weak, but each day brought a little more strength back to him. Tom visited often, bringing news of Max, and the dog never failed to perk up at the mention of his name. Finally, after a long and difficult week, the day came when George was allowed to return home. Tom drove him back to the cottage, and as they pulled up to the house, Max was waiting at the door, his tail wagging furiously, his whole body trembling with excitement. George stepped out of the car, moving slowly, but with a wide smile on his face. "Max," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Good boy." Max bounded toward him, barking joyfully as he circled George, nuzzling his hand, as if to reassure himself that George was really there. The two stood together in the doorway, and for the first time in weeks, the cottage felt like home again. George's return to the cottage marked the beginning of a long road to recovery. The doctors had made it clear he wasn't out of the woods yet, He would need plenty of rest, careful monitoring, and regular checkups to ensure his heart would heal properly. But none of that seemed to matter as much to George now that he was home, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his small, quiet life. Max never left his side. From the moment George walked back through the door, Max acted as if his sole purpose was to watch over him. The dog would follow George from room to room, his eyes always alert, his ears perked for any sign of trouble. At night, Max curled up at the foot of George's bed, his breathing soft and steady, as if his very presence was enough to keep George safe. It was slow going at first. George was weak, and even the simplest tasks, like making tea or walking to the front door, left him winded and shaky. But Max was there, always there, nudging him with gentle encouragement, offering companionship that no human could provide. Tom and the other villagers checked in often, bringing meals and helping with chores around the house. They were careful not to overstay their welcome, knowing that George valued his privacy, but their presence brought a new sense of community into George's life. The isolation that had once felt comforting now seemed distant and unnecessary. George began to realize how much he had closed himself off after Margaret's death, and how Max, in his own quiet way, had opened a door that George hadn't even realized was locked. One afternoon, as George sat by the fire, Max lying contentedly by his feet, Tom came by for a visit. He had a bag of groceries in one hand and a smile on his face. "You're looking better," he said as he placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. "I can see you've got your strength coming back." George smiled faintly, his hand resting on Max's head. "I'm getting there, slowly but surely. This one here has been looking after me." Tom chuckled, kneeling down to pet Max. "He's a good dog, George. Loyal as they come." "That he is," George said softly, his eyes misting over. "I don't know what I would have done without him." Tom glanced at George, sensing the depth of his words. "You don't have to do it alone, you know. We're all here for you. You've got friends, George. And Max, well, he's made sure you've got second chance." George nodded, the weight of those words settling into his chest. A second chance. It was something he had never expected at this stage in his life, something he hadn't even known he needed. But now that it was here, he wasn't going to waste it. Max lifted his head, as if understanding the significance of the moment, his eyes meeting George's with quiet affection. There was no doubt in George's mind that this dog, this stray that had appeared on his doorstep on a stormy night, had saved him in more ways than one. Word of Max's heroics had spread quickly through the village. What had once been a sleepy little town where nothing much happened had suddenly become a place of interest. People began to stop George on his walks with Max, asking for the story, marveling at the bond between the two. "He really saved your life," one woman asked as George passed the bakery, Max trotting dutifully at his side. George nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He did. "If it weren't for Max, I don't think I'd be here today." The woman crouched down, offering Max a treat from her apron pocket. Max accepted it gratefully, wagging his tail in appreciation. "What a good boy," she cooed, ruffling his fur. "You've got yourself a real hero, George." George smiled, but as he walked away, a thought lingered in his mind. Max wasn't just a hero. He was more than that. He was family. The kind of family George hadn't had since Margaret's passing. The villagers saw Max as a local legend, a miracle dog that had performed an extraordinary act. But to George, Max was the reason his days had meaning again, the reason he woke up each morning with a sense of purpose. As the days passed, George noticed how much Max had changed the way others in the village treated him. Once, he had been the quiet old man who lived at the edge of town, a man to be respected but largely left alone. Now people waved at him from across the street, stopped to chat with him in the square, and even invited him to tea. It was as if Max had opened a door not just to George's heart, but to the world around him as well. But there was something else, too. Max had become a symbol of hope for many in the village. People who had once dismissed stray animals as nuisances now looked at them differently, with a new sense of respect. It wasn't uncommon to see villagers leaving out food and water for the local strays, hoping to help the next Max that came along. George had even overheard talk of the village starting an initiative to care for the homeless animals that wandered through the town. One evening, as George sat by the fire with Max at his feet, he thought back to the night the dog had first appeared on his doorstep. He had been so close to turning the dog away, so sure that he didn't need the responsibility of caring for another living being. But Max had stayed, and in doing so, he had given George more than just companionship. He had given him a second chance at life, at love, at connection. George reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. "You know," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "you've changed everything." Max looked up at him, his eyes soft and warm, as if he understood exactly what George meant. The bond between them was unspoken, but it was as strong as any George had ever known. As the fire crackled in the hearth, and the evening shadows grew long, George allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for himself, but for the world around him. Because if a stray dog could save a life, who knew what other small miracles might be waiting just around the corner? George awoke early one morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains in a way that seemed to beckon him outside. He felt stronger today, more alive than he had in a long time. Max was already awake, sitting by the door with his tail wagging, ready for their morning walk. It had become a ritual for them, one that marked not just the start of the day, but the start of something new in George's life. He got dressed slowly, careful not to overexert himself, but with each passing day, his body grew stronger, his heart more resilient. The doctors had been pleased with his progress, and they encouraged him to keep walking, keep moving, as it would help speed up his recovery. But George didn't need their encouragement. With Max by his side, he felt like he had all the motivation he needed. They set off down the familiar path through the woods, the same path they had walked so many times before. The leaves had changed again, now a bright shade of green as spring settled in, bringing new life to the forest. Birds sang from the treetops, and a soft breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the air. Max trotted ahead, occasionally looking back to make sure George was following. George smiled to himself, taking in the beauty of the morning. For the first time in years, he felt connected to the world around him. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living. He had spent so much time mourning the past, locked in a cycle of grief and isolation, that he had forgotten what it meant to be part of something bigger. Max had changed that. The dog had given him a reason to keep going, to open himself up to the possibility of joy again. As they reached the clearing at the edge of the woods, George stopped to rest, leaning on his cane. Max circled him, barking playfully, urging him to keep moving. George chuckled, shaking his head. All right, he muttered, taking a few more steps before sitting on a nearby bench. Max sat at his feet, his tail thumping against the ground. George looked down at him, feeling a swell of gratitude for the dog's unwavering loyalty. "I owe you more than I can say, Max," George said softly. "You've given me more than just another chance. You've given me a reason to be." Max tilted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of George's voice. The bond between them was unbreakable, stronger now than ever before. George knew that Max had been sent to him for a reason, even if he couldn't fully explain it. The universe worked in mysterious ways, and sometimes it took the form of a stray dog on a stormy night. They sat together in silence for a while, enjoying the peace of morning. George thought about the future, about what his life would look like now that he was no longer living in the shadow of his grief. He had always thought his story had ended when Margaret passed away, but now he realized that it had simply been a new chapter waiting to unfold. With Max by his side, George felt ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments of contentment. George's recovery continued, and though he still had a long way to go, he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He had learned to take each day as it came, to find joy in the small things: a walk with Max, a cup of tea by the fire, a friendly conversation with one of the villagers. The people in the village had become more than just acquaintances now. They had become friends, a community that had rallied around George in his time of need. And George, in turn, had begun to open himself up to them. He attended village events, accepted invitations for tea, and even started volunteering at the local animal shelter. It felt good to be part of something again, to know that he was making a difference, no matter how small. Max had become a fixture in the village as well. Everyone knew him as the hero dog, and it wasn't uncommon for people to stop and greet him when George took him for walks. Max soaked up the attention, wagging his tail and accepting treats from anyone who offered them. One afternoon, as George and Max strolled through the village square, they stopped by the fountain, where a group of children were playing. Max immediately trotted over to them, his tail wagging furiously as the kids surrounded him with laughter and affection. "He's really something, isn't he?" a voice said from behind. George turned to see Anna, one of the villagers who had helped him on the night of his heart attack, standing nearby. She smiled warmly, watching as Max played with the children. "He sure is," George replied, his voice filled with pride. "I don't know what I'd do without him." Anna nodded, her gaze softening. "He's brought a lot of joy to this village, you know, and to you too." George smiled, his eyes following Max as he ran around the fountain. "Yes, he has. More than I ever thought possible." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the scene before them. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the village square, and for the first time in a long while, George felt truly at peace. "Life has a funny way of surprising you," Anna said softly, as if reading his thoughts. "You never know what's waiting just around the corner." George nodded, knowing she was right. He had spent so many years believing that his best days were behind him, but Max had shown him that life could be full of unexpected joy, even in its later stages. There was still so much to live for, so much to experience. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the children began to scatter, George called for Max, who came bounding over, his tongue lolling out in a joyful pant. "Come on, boy," George said, patting Max on the head. "Let's go home." As they walked back toward the cottage, George couldn't help but feel a sense of completeness. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, but it had changed for the better. He had found companionship, purpose, and a new sense of belonging, all thanks to a dog who had appeared on his doorstep one stormy night. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, George knew that no matter what the future held, he was ready for it, because life, after all, goes on.